Good morning, shalom. My name is Jeremy Milarsky. I am a white male, about 5'7". I have dark brown hair with tinges of gray and white and a mustache. I'm going to begin today with a little bit of a story, an older one. This goes about 30 years ago. I was an undergraduate at University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida, a town not very dissimilar from Columbia. And like most big college campuses, we had speakers come to campus of varying degrees of fame. We had rappers, and we had Timothy Leary come once. We had Noam Chomsky come once. This particular speech was by a Hollywood actor named William Shatner. And today's sermon is, as you can see from the order of service and the spaceship on the front of it, is going to be about a piece of pop culture called Star Trek that is really significant in Western culture now. I'll go into that in a second, but William Shatner is known as the first actor to play Captain Kirk on the original television series in the 60s. He's also kind of a ham. And he's known for being for overacting and drawing out his lines, and you really kind of he's not Daniel Day-Lewis. He's not known as some big famous great actor, and he also is kind of boring, it turns out. So back in the 90s. You have to imagine this. All thousands of students are filing into the O'Connell Stadium in Gainesville to see William Shatner speak. We have no idea what to expect. We have no idea what he's going to talk about. There are people there who are dressed in various cosplay. There's about 5 people who are dressed as an alien race called Klingons, which, trust me, there's a lot of makeup. When you dress up as a Klingon, there's a uniform and everything. And just watching the 10 minutes of the first 10 minutes of the William Shatner speech, and watching the crowd's kind of slow disappointment, and watching the Klingons walk out, and was something I won't soon forget. So there are 2 takeaways from the William Shatner speech that I want to bring up today. One is the bar is set pretty low for today's sermon. I can't do too much worse than Bill Shatner did back at UM. And more importantly, the one thing he talked about that was related to Star Trek was the most infamous Star Trek movie. So again, to explain Star Trek to you again, it started out as a silly science fiction television show in the 1960s with sort of this message of optimism. It is a diverse but talented crew team going out and trekking among the stars and finding weird alien races and different scientific phenomenon. It is at its best, Star Trek, a platform, and most fiction for that matter, a platform for asking big questions. That's really what I'm going to talk about today, is how these silly science fiction stories and fantasy stories have been a platform for asking big questions. But back to Bill Shatner, he talks about the worst Star Trek movie. Star Trek has been, at least 6 different television series, 3 of which are on the air today, 11 different feature films, animated series, live action series. It's a big cultural phenomenon. There have been hundreds of writers contributing to Star Trek. Star Trek V came out, I want to say, in the 90s or the 80s. Someone laughed. They know how bad this movie is. Mr. Shatner explained that his idea for Star Trek V was, and I quote, "What happens if the crew of the Enterprise meets God?" And God turns out to be, I should have done slides for this presentation, because God turns out to be literally a floating, glowing head. And it's not really God. It's an evil alien that's pretending to be God. He's just a floating head, and he needs a starship. And the jig is up when the captain asks, "Why does God need a starship?" But the point of the story is this is considered the worst Star Trek movie. It is panned by the critics, and yet, it is an example of how this piece of pop culture has never been shy about asking questions of theology, about getting into theology, about getting into big questions, however clumsy it is. So we have, Shatner is arguably, again, this is my opinion, he's arguably one of, relatively speaking, the least talented person to touch Star Trek. And even he was not shy about Star Trek meeting big questions, big ideas. I have been privileged, as Jamila mentioned earlier, to be the Addams Family class teacher for the last 3 years. That's basically middle school age students. I think I've experienced more spiritual growth through that experience than I have through any kind of meditation or walks through the woods, honestly. It has been almost cheating to call it work, because I get to sit with your children and watch silly pieces of pop culture and then talk about it. And often I learn from them. It is in no way a one-way street. I want to share this experience of learning from the kids, even though it doesn't really intersect with Star Trek, just very briefly. We watched the Twilight Zone, the old Twilight Zone series, one unit. We do a different unit every year. Last unit was Star Trek Next Generation. The year before that was the Twilight Zone, the old one. And there's a show in the Twilight Zone that I was showing the kids as kind of like a spooky episode. It's about an omnipotent kid who is pure evil, who terrorizes a small American town. And there's a moral challenge that's set up for the audience in this episode, because you have a monster in the town. He's introduced as a monster. Rod Serling, who was at UU, by the way, introduces the episode and says, there's a monster in this village, and then they show the monster. It's a little boy. And the little boy's playing, and we're shown that he's cruel to animals, and he's torturing the villagers, and so on and so forth. But no one will take action to stand up to the monster, because he's a kid, because he's in the form of innocence, and it is unthinkable to do anything to confront or anything violent against a child villain. And what the Addams Family students taught me was they were in no way confounded by this moral dilemma, because the villain was put in the same form as them. So evil, fictional evil, fortunately, was relative to this audience. There's another piece of pop culture that we talked about in class. They're rebooting the Interview with the Vampire series. If you're like me and you watch too much TV, you're aware of that. And the Interview with the Vampire novels introduces a vampire that is a little girl. And the reason why she is so scary and deadly is because she's a little girl, and she could pretend to be a little girl lost in a downtown area. And people like the folks who volunteer for RE are her hapless victims, because it's a lost little girl, and then boop, you're dead. She's a vampire. Don't go help that little girl, Claudia the vampire. But the kids in Adam's class taught me, it was almost like a light went on. It's like, they don't see the problem here. They would have no problem with standing up to Anthony Fremont, the evil, omnipotent kid in the Twilight Zone episode. And they also brought that kind of similar perspective to when we were watching other pieces of pop culture. There's wisdom in childhood, and sharing these stories with other generations and getting their perspective leads to their richness and their utility in helping us frame reality. Star Trek, though, has been the best for asking the big questions. It has been really good for posing questions that come up with the best discussions. And another thing that I've learned from our kids is that it's not always a good idea to it's not always a good idea to show good quality pop culture. Bad quality pop culture can lead to very good discussions. We have torn apart some terrible, terrible Star Trek episodes, and there are some very, very bad ones. I'll talk about some of the good ones next, and I want to talk about some of the ideas that the series introduced when we were going through it, and some of the pieces of wisdom that kind of came out of our class discussions. Very often we send the children downstairs. I think I'm kind of trying to bring something upstairs here. So we watched Star Trek The Next Generation, which aired roughly from 1989 to 1993 or so. I don't know why I'm looking at Ramsey. It's like she's correcting me. But it had a cast of about 8 people, and we watched about 8 different episodes of varying degrees of quality. The first I want to talk about has sort of a place near and dear to my heart. It's an episode called The Measure of the Man, and it features a character in Star Trek. And I'm going to have to explain a lot of Star Trek to you guys today, so just bear with me. One of the characters is what's called an android, which is a robot that acts, looks, and interacts with humans. His name is Data. He's a beloved character on the series, played by Brent Spiner. And Data is an android. He doesn't have the capacity for emotion, but he also has the capacity for kind of empathy. He saves people's lives countless times. He's a friend to the crew. He even has a relationship with one of the other members of the crew. And there's an episode where he's put on trial because the question is raised of whether Data is property. So I need to rewind a little bit about how pop culture, at least in my experience, I was born in 1974. Pop culture has evolved in my lifetime to ask these questions about human rights and ask these questions about what is a person and who has rights. And oh, I didn't know we were going to be able to do this. This is great. The Measure of a Man puts him on trial. That is the culmination of almost a century of pop culture. The very first artificial human story that had success was a couple of rich people sitting around in a fireplace, and one of them, Mary Shelley, came up with Frankenstein. And that artificial human story was one of a very specific type. Man invents man, or human invents human, excuse me. And human turns out to run amok and question their identity and question their creator, even tries to murder their own creator, and the questions that are raised by that, and that kind of existential crisis. To Isaac Asimov, the mid-20th century science fiction writer, inventing robots that were governed by a very strict system of ethics. And they do make a reference to Isaac Asimov in Star Trek. In the very first episode of Star Trek: Next Generation, they say Data is the culmination of Asimov's dream of a positronic brain. Isaac Asimov was known to have visited the set of Star Trek back in the 1960s. He was friends with Gene Roddenberry, the inventor of Star Trek. And so Data is kind of the culmination of these very deep questions about what is a person. And not coincidentally, the subject of slavery is brought up in this episode from back in 1990, where a robot is on trial. Does the robot have rights? And if we're questioning whether the robot has rights at this point, are we not bringing up the question of what happens when we have disposable people? Are we not bringing up the question of dignity, of inherent human dignity? If we use the word, if you have the word asterisk, the asterisk by human, what makes a human? And this intersects with our very first principle, doesn't it? And I see a lot of nodding heads in the room. And so we wrestled with that. Of course, fiction and fiction writers have all kinds of tricks to make us, maybe lean a certain way. I mean, before we see this episode, we see lots of, likable moments with Data, so we're kind of biased at this point. But it does bring up, some hard questions. Possibly one of the most well-known episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation, the one that kind of is usually ranked in the top 5 when you have critics kind of get together and talk about it, is one called Inner Light. And this is going to take a little bit of explaining, so bear with me. All right. So the Enterprise is in space. Captain is on the bridge, and they encounter this little this little probe out in space, and the probe zaps the captain with his kind of laser beam, and all of a sudden he falls asleep, he's unconscious. And what the crew doesn't know, they're trying to revive him. They think he's sick. They think the probe is, zapped him with something bad. And the crew, in the regular world, the crew is trying to revive him. But in his perception, he has been mysteriously transported to a strange planet with a somewhat primitive culture. And everybody thinks he is someone else. They think he's this man who has lived up until his time, has a family, has a wife, is a member of the village, a respected member of their community, and he thinks he's still a Star Trek captain. So for the first couple of years of his perceived experience, he's trying to get back to the ship. Eventually, he kind of settles into life in this village, lives a very fulfilling life, raises 2 children with his wife. Meanwhile, in this strange village, in this strange planet, it becomes apparent to him that the sun is going nova, and they're not a very advanced society. They maybe can send a rocket into space. This is a shot of him. In his second life here on this planet, he studies the stars. He learns how to play flute. He has a meaningful relationship with his spouse. But the planet's dying on this fake world. The planet's dying. The sun's going nova. What's their solution? They don't have one. They send a probe into space to zap this strange random guy with their story so that he experiences their story. He experiences what life would have been like if he had lived among them. All right, so we figure it doesn't say how long he's there. He's there maybe 20, 30 years. By the time he's at the end of it, he has almost all but forgotten his former life as a starship captain. I think his name's Catan, flute player, amateur scientist, realizes that the world's going supernova, realizes that the other scientists know the world's going to go supernova. What does the society do? They send a probe into space to tell their story. Now, this is a bummer, but I was born in '74. I grew up with the Jetsons. I grew up with early Star Trek. And most science fiction a lot of science fiction, I should say, had a very optimistic tone. There was a feeling that, humanity is going to live on forever and ever and ever. It's going to be this constant upward swing. Everybody's life is going to get better. And as a human person, recent events have kind of shook that perception a little bit. Maybe we have a life cycle. Maybe our race has a life cycle. And eventually it will end, just like we naturally end. I don't know. I'm just asking questions here. But if you knew you were doomed, then the natural thing is to tell your story so that you're not forgotten. And this was not really, again, explored in great detail in the episode. This whole thing where, they told their story. Maybe you should tell your story, Jeremy. The show says to me in my imagination. And that is a way of being human, isn't it? It is to me. That's the first lesson of Inner Light. The second one is part of a story. I mentioned earlier that there's many facets of Star Trek. I will not bore you with all of them, all the different television shows and what they explore. I will say that the Star Trek universe is so large that we have heard 2 theme songs for 2 different television series just here today in this service. The opening prelude and Neil and Alan were playing. Thank you very much, extremely talented and beautiful. Was from Deep Space Nine. The one we just heard was from the original series. Deep Space Nine has an episode that I think is, if you kind of picture a coin, it's the opposite side of the coin to Inner Light. So Deep Space Nine takes place aboard a space station. It's another talented crew. They encounter strange alien races. They encounter difficult ethical questions. One of them in this episode, called Hard Time, is a working class hero. He's an engineer named Miles O'Brien. He disobeys a rule on an alien planet, and in this alien planet they have a very interesting approach to corrections and jail. on this planet, if you are accused of a crime, arrested for a crime, and they found it to be wasteful to build prisons and hire guards, so they zap you with a ray, like they do like another mind ray, right, that I had in the last episode, except for this one zaps you to another life where you're in solitary confinement for 20, 30 years. And instead of coming back like Picard from his second life with this enriching experience, having the wisdom of having lived as a community member and a scientist and a father for 20, 30 years, Miles O'Brien comes back with the trauma of 20 or 30 years of solitary confinement. He is suicidal. Now, I can't overstate this. A Star Trek crew character, stereotypically from 1960 to 1994, was like the best of us. If you made it aboard the Enterprise in this fictional universe, you were a guy, who got straight A's and, ran the marathon, and you don't have suicidal Star Trek crew members. That never happened before, but give someone enough trauma, give someone enough suffering. Hard Time is about quality of life. Inner Light is about life. And watching the two episodes together shows you both sides of the coin. And it is a very difficult lesson because every moment of life is precious. And yet, there are horrors that make it difficult. And then there are some circumstances where, does life fly in the face of dignity in its extreme forms? I don't know. I'm here to ask questions. The last Star Trek story I'll talk about is one that is one of my favorites and really jives, I think, with modern times. It was very prescient. There's an episode where the Enterprise encounters an alien race that their language is not made the way ours is. Their language is made in metaphors. So they never will talk in literal sentences. They would never say, a Tarmarian would never say, I am feeling nervous right now. Instead, they would say, I am Napoleon Dynamite on stage before he does his dance. Or if I'm feeling romantic and waiting for my wife to arrive home, I am Juliet waiting at the balcony. They speak, everything's a metaphor. And so if you don't know the Tarmarians' pop culture, you don't understand them. And so picture being a person who maybe is not familiar with modern pop culture looking at a meme today. It was very prescient and using stories and anecdotes to convey meaning in a way that conveys meaning almost better than literal words. So I actually challenged the students to come up with their own Tarmanian phrases. What do memes say? How would you create this sentence if you were talking to somebody of that race? And the episode itself is almost a puzzle, where you can figure out what's being said after you've watched it, it breaks it down. It breaks communication down into language on a fundamental level that I think speaks, and this is why I want to close with this story. I think it speaks to the value of Star Trek and other pieces of pop culture in a smaller package. Because if language and anecdote can convey greater meaning than language in its pure form, so too can fiction help us grasp reality. Star Trek has wrestled with a lot of things before its time. There was an episode with what I would call, if you watch it, I think it's objectively a transgender character in 1991, and it is treated with dignity. It's not perfect. You could probably write it better now, but in 1991, it is impressive for its groundbreaking material. The first interracial kiss happened on Star Trek. iPads, mobile phones, all were conceived on, in Star Trek before they were here in our reality. So it presents us with metaphors that can help us grasp the bigger questions and help us get to greater wisdom than we might normally be able to get to, and it is something that you can do communally. Enjoying pop culture is something that is best done communally. I would never have known, for example, that unique perspective in watching the Omnipotent Kid episode if I wasn't watching it with young people. Stories are important. We are storytelling creatures. We make sense of this world through our stories. And they don't often give us answers. But they are quite good for pondering the questions with a little bit of wisdom. There ends the sermon. Thank you.